helping you with Acorn and RISC OS computing.
Excellent. Okay, so my name is Mark Stevens. Thank you very much for inviting me along. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk all about using RISC OS and Mac. I've got a little notes presentation. I'm going to do the talk on my Mac, and I'm going to connect to some RISC OS boxes and some Linux boxes. So please ask any questions that you have in the chat forum. I'll try and glance across it. My setup on my desk is I have a 27-inch monitor in front of me, and I've got my MacBook Pro just down beside me. So I will run it as two screens, and if I keep glancing down, it's because I'm looking at my notes. So let me fire off first of all. Okay, so I'm going to talk about RISC OS and Mac. I'm going to talk about RISC OS, I'm going to talk about Macs, I'm going to talk about getting them to work together. I'm going to give a list of things I'd like to see. I'm going to have a moan about things, and I hope we're going to have an enjoyable and interesting time. So let me just check. Oh yes, I'm going to show you some of my favorite software tools as well, and hopefully everything will work. The demo gods will not be too vicious. Okay, so if you haven't heard of me, let me introduce myself. I live in Kent, which is in the southern part of Yorkshire, so I don't get up to Wakefield very often. I actually live in a little village called East Peckham, which has absolutely nothing to do with Del Boy. It's in the green garden of England, so we have hops fields around us, we have apple fields. I quite often do my business calls in the fields, and people wonder why I'm so relaxed. So I live in a little house with well, not too little, with my wife, 2 children when they're home from uni, and 2 cats. So I'm hoping aren't going to leap in and interrupt the talk and steal the show. I actually have a degree in medieval history from St Andrews. I actually got into RISC OS at St Andrews. I ended up in IT because I am one of the world's greatest experts on Mediterranean shipping, 850 to 1350, but there's not a lot of money in that. So I decided to get into IT instead. I did actually discover after I left St Andrews, there was another big RISC OS fan at St Andrews called Jim LaSurf. We never actually met at St Andrews. It was full of Mac users, so us RISC OS users tended to keep our heads down a little bit. I started using RISC OS in 1988, 1999 at university. Previously, I was a Commodore fan. I had a VIC-20 and I had a Commodore 128. And then I remember, I think it was Jim Nagel writing a review saying, by all means, buy an Amiga, but don't buy an Amiga and then try the Archimedes afterwards. So I tried the Archimedes and fully agreed with him. So I got my A3000 through the university because I got a nice educational discount at it. You may have heard of me because I used to write lots of articles for the website Drove. I also write articles for Archive. For the last couple of years, I've done a Mac Matters column until I was fired by the new editor for not being funny enough. I have been writing articles for the Icon Bar since 2016 when Jeffrey Lee said, would somebody please write some articles? So I've been writing regular articles. So if I pester you for an article or an interview, you can blame Jeffrey. And I do a couple of articles for the ROCC magazine as well. So that's where you may have come across me. I've been a Mac user since 2004. And I've had a selection of machines in that time, starting with the A3000, A5000, RISC PC, Ionix, large selection of Raspberry Pi, lots of laptops and MacBooks. I tend to upgrade my MacBook every 3 years. RISC OS machines slightly less. My current setup is I have a Titanium. I have one of these nice little Pi Hards and a Fortress. I use RPC MU on my Mac. I'll be showing you that and talking about when I use which machine and why. And I have an Intel MacBook Pro. I would really like to buy an ARM MacBook Pro, but the Intel MacBook Pro is currently fast enough and I can't justify it. I was hoping they would kill off my version of the Intel, so I'd have to upgrade, but they haven't done that yet. My day job is I run a software company called IDL Solutions, which I set up in 1999. I was working for a small publishing operation called News International up at Wapping. So they were my first customer, which was quite nice. And I decided with the insanity of use that I'd write a PDF library in Java because no one else had done it. I thought it would take 4 years to do, and I'm still writing it. These days, it's not just me. I have 10 other people to do it. Some interesting background on that is the first version of code was actually written on my RISC PC. I had a Intel card for it, and I used a piece of software called Visual Cafe, which allowed you to write Java 1.1, I think it was. I was hoping that Acorn would release Java 1.2 on the Archimedes, but obviously Java never happened. But I've stuck with the Java angle. So the original version of our software was written using the RISC PC. I also used a piece of software you might remember called RI script because it allowed you to figure out the coordinates on the page of a PDF And when I was trying to figure out how all that complex matrix multiplication worked, it was very useful to be able to use it. And I also use Zap because I open PDF files and text editors, and I'll be showing you Zap doing that later, which is a bit of fun. So that's my day job, working for the company, and I've done that since 1999. I have the standard software career in that I did a degree in medieval history. I then did a PGC at Loughborough. I then went and taught for 5 years. I then decided I'd get out of education, worked up at News International for 3 years, set up my own company. So that's been my standard career. Okay, so that's all about me. And as I said, the original code for my software was written on the RISC PC using the ARM card and using some Acorn software to debug the file format. So let's talk about Macs first. So Mac has, in the time I've been on it, moved from 3 architectures. So originally Mac was on a Motorola chip called the PowerPC. In around 2006, Apple decided that they're going to move from that chip because they didn't think it had a future. They were also very keen to be able to Windows on Macs because Windows at that time was really, really important. So they ported their entire range of machines to Intel. And since 2006, all the Apple machines, other than their phones, have run on Intel chips. They started using ARM chips on their iPhone and their iPad devices. And they also finally decided that Intel chips are going to go nowhere. So they introduced this new idea called Apple Silicon. Apple Silicon is actually ARM core or multiple ARM cores with an awful lot of other stuff on. So you've got graphics processing units there, you've got AI engines, all sorts of exotic hardware there. It is, of course, ironic that Apple has now gone back to ARM because they were one of the people who created ARM. So the history of ARM was a partnership between Apple and Acorn and I think it's VSLI because Apple wanted to use the ARM chips in their infamous Newton portable device. So it's quite fitting that Apple has come back to ARM chips. And this week, Apple has had their WWDC, so Worldwide Developer Conference, and they moved the last set of machines, which is the Mac Pro, to ARM-based silicon. So all of Apple's machines are now off Intel and using ARM. So they've had 3 transitions. They've had a lot of practice moving software from one version to another. And in some respects, there may be some interesting parallels with what's happened on Acorn, moving from different versions of Intel, moving on to different versions of ARM as well. So under the bonnet of the Apple, it's an operating system. It was originally called OS X. It's Unix under the bonnet. It uses a BSD kernel. Was released in 1999. And essentially what Apple did was they took the Unix that Steve Jobs created at Next Step. So Steve Jobs was kicked out of Apple. He went off and founded another company called Next Step, which built its own operating system and hardware based on Unix. Then they brought him back to save the company. And he created a new version of the Mac operating system. Obviously, the previous was OS 9. So OS X was a replacement of it, which was essentially Apple's pretty GUI on top of Unix. And that works really nice. And what Apple now does is they have a yearly update of the operating system. So I've just announced the latest version of the operating system, which is called Sonoma. For some time, they named it after big cats. So there was tiger, there was leopard, there was snow leopard. They eventually ran out of large, fierce creatures, so they decided they were going to name it after places in San Francisco. It was either that or not upgrading the software anyway. What's also interesting with Apple is that it's actually quite an astute move to give away the operating system. So it means that they have very few versions to support. So they're not supporting multiple operating systems because everyone can get the latest version for free. And Apple makes most of its money from selling hardware. So what happens is you suddenly find your hardware no longer runs the latest free operating system, so you update your hardware. So it's an interesting business model for Apple, making the operating system free and selling the hardware. Just checking my notes. Yeah. So what do I like about the Mac? The reason I like to use the Mac is really the following reasons. First of all, it has a really nice GUI. I'm not going to show you the GUI in the talk other than for demoing, but if you'd like to, I can show it to you afterwards. But I personally think it's pretty, it's functional. It has lots of nice keyboard shortcuts. It's quick and I can use it. I've never been a fan of Windows UI or its interface. I definitely think the Mac looks nice and it's easy to use. And if you're going to spend 8 to 10 hours working on a computer in a day. You want to drive a nice car. It integrates well with my iPhone and my iPad, which I use, so I can live my life across them. And I'll show you how I set up things across both Apple and RISC OS. It also has Time Machine. Time Machine's fantastic. So what Time Machine does is it sits up here in the background, and it automatically backs up the software. Sorry, let me go back to sharing the screen. What's the screen share? Okay, so time. Is it showing my screen? I haven't got the box around it. Can you see my screen with?
Yes, it says what I like about my Mac.
Perfect. So Time Machine sits up here in the background, and it just backs up everything in the background, and that's fantastic. Because what happened 2 weeks ago is I decided to install the new version of the TCP/I stack on my RPC emulator, and it screwed up for some reason. So all I had to do was to jump into Time Machine and revert my installation, and I was back to back to the version I originally used. So you can jump into the browser and back things up. So it's easy to just go back. So I had my copy of my RISC OS RPC MU. So all I did was essentially chose a version to revert back to and reverted back to it. Backup is brilliant if it happens in the background, because generally the only time you decide you want to get a backup is when you've screwed up something. And that's the point where you realize it would be really nice if I could actually back it up. So Time Machine is seamless. It just keeps backing things up in the background. So it's one of my favorite features of the machine. Okay. Can you still see my screen? It should now be in full screen mode.
Yep.
Okay. So Time Machine's fantastic. It's also generally a really fast machine. I don't spend a lot of time waiting for stuff. As I say, I'm a bit frustrated because I can't justify upgrading it to a new ARM M2 chip just yet. It has virtual screens, which is really nice. So again, what I tend to do is I have a screen and I have different backgrounds. So this screen here is the one where I generally do my work. I'm doing some coding on this one. So I've got a window in terminal where I run my tests. If you're familiar with Maven, these are all the tests that I just quietly run to check any changes I put in. So this is my coding screen where I generally have IntelliJ or NetBeans to write code. This is my general screen for work. Let's put another screen up and let's put RPCMU. No, that doesn't have a full screen mode. Okay, let's put this up. What you can also do is you can do there. So here I've got my screen here. I can just switch between them. I can also switch there and I can choose which desktop to go. So again, it's really seamless sharing and I can easily drag windows from one screen to another. So I really like the way the desktop screen sharing works. Let's come back. Okay. I can run Dash and Java as well, which is important to me because I do a lot of stuff with the command line. And I can run Linux via Parallels, and I can run RISC OS on a single machine. So there's a nice little virtualization software called Parallels here. I've got my second screen with everything hidden away to drag on. So let's just find that. So this means I've actually got, so here I've got Mint running. So I've got a Mint screen here. Okay. I've got the right password. No. Have it set to log on automatically. That's it. So I've got Mint running here. I can run Mint in full screen. And one of the amusing things is because I've actually got Linux here, when I started using RPCMU, I was actually running RPCMU inside Linux on a Mac. So I can run all of these separate operating systems on just the one machine, which is fantastic. And I'm going to show you how I run RISC OS on it as well. So let's carry on down my list of reasons I like it. Oh yes, it's a well-made and reliable laptop. It's stylish, it's light, it has a good battery life, and it's not Windows. I'm sorry, I've just never managed to live with Windows. I just don't like Windows. I just can't get, me and Windows just don't get on. So that's important about it. Okay, so I didn't put it on the list, but another thing is generally you are very rarely getting viruses on the Mac. And every time there is something, Apple rushes out an update, so you can update the machine. So that's what I like about the Mac. So let's talk about RISC OS, and then we're going to put the two together. So RISC OS has always been fast and responsive. It's really nice to use. If you are still using a RISC PC or old machine, I would definitely recommend that you buy one of the fast new modern machines. While RISC OS doesn't need anything or is very economical on resources, I've got one of RISC OS Bit's nice Pi hard machines here. I've got a titanium, and I've got a Pi 400, and these things really fly on RISC OS. So I would definitely recommend thinking about a new machine if you haven't got it, because RISC OS is just so nice to use on these types of hardware. So partly I think it is nostalgia. I've been using RISC OS since '89 when I was really young and living even closer to Yorkshire. But I think familiarity is important as well. The software is really easy and intuitive to use. I do think it also has a really nice GUI, possibly not quite as developed, polished as the MacOS. I think we could steal a lot of ideas from there. It still has some excellent software, which is fast and easy to use. I think where we lack things in RISC OS is essentially where there's new categories like browsers or so forth, or TikTok or something, and we haven't got anything on it. I've just noticed there are 2 comments in chat, so I'm just going to check whether anyone wants to, if there's any questions. So I can't see the comments in. Okay, that's good. Please do talk about yourself. Okay, so it's fast and sorry, I don't tend to use most screens, but don't tend to use dual screen most of the time, so I'm not familiar with it. Okay, I'll talk about how I set the machine up later. Okay, so it's a really nice GUI, still has some excellent software, which is really easy to use. Apart from file or ops, I also find it really fast and responsive. The bugbear of my life is essentially slow disk operations. I'm very pleased that I'll be talking about CloudFS last time, and that has had an order of magnitude file speed up, and I'll show you how I use FileFS and why I'm really pleased about that. Okay, so let's talk about running on RISC OS, and then come off the slides and do some practical demos. So in theory, there are 3 ways to use RISC OS on a Mac. The first of all is remote VNC. I'll talk more in detail on VNC. You could, and I'll show you how VNC works later. You could also potentially have emulation on Mac or Linux. Again, because the Mac could run Linux via Boot Camp Parallels or others, the other one, VMware. You can potentially run RPC MU on both of those. You also originally had a virtual RISC PC, which doesn't currently run on the latest Macs, and I'll explain why later. In theory, you could run RISC OS directly on a Mac box because it's got an ARM chip inside it. The problem with that is essentially, first of all, it's a 64-bit chip. Secondly, it's not just an ARM chip. There's an awful lot of other stuff hidden there, which is not documented. Apple doesn't want people to run anything other than the Mac on their system, so they don't document it. So ideally, somebody in the Linux world would come up with a Linux version, and then we could see how they did it. So maybe one day, but there's quite a lot of work to get it running on a 64-bit chip with a lot of custom hardware before we can do it. I'm going to talk about the choice between each of 1 and 2. I see it very much as a trade-off between speed over convenience. I will generally use emulation when I'm on the road. For when I'm at home or in the office, I have a couple of remote boxes that I can access via VNC. But if I'm going, I travel up to Leicester to work in our Leicester offices once a month. I don't really want to take a lot of hardware with me, so I just take the laptop with our RPC MU on it, and I'm going to show all of those in a minute to you. I did try accessing my ARM boxes remotely via punching a hole in my firewall, but I found that was way too slow for access. So I'm not a fan of that. So for me, it's either remote, it's either emulation on the road or it's remote access at home. And I'm going to show you both of those shortly and talk about which I like and why. Okay, so let's talk about VNC on RISC OS. So VNC is a rather clever technique. What it does is you have the concept of a server, which is the machine you want to display the graphics for, and you have a client. So you can essentially run VNC between multiple machines. If we're going to run it on RISC OS, we have as server tools, we have VNC Serve. PyTools also has a nice built-in VNC server. So that allows us to display RISC OS screen to anything that has a VNC client. MacOS has a built-in VNC client, which is very useful. VNC can also run in what's called headless. Headless means that I don't have to plug my machine into a monitor. So on my desk, my 27-inch monitor that I'm doing this talk through has a USB-C port for my Mac, and it has 2 HDMI cables. I currently got 4 boxes plugged in here. I don't want to have to keep unplugging and plugging them in. But because I can run them in headless mode, I can plug it in without a connection to the monitor. So I can run it from VNC. And I'm going to show you this shortly. Speed depends on your network, and unfortunately, RISC OS, VNC Serve, and PyTools don't appear to support compressed data. So they can't use the fastest settings to send data to the client. So there's a slight lag, and I'm going to show that to you later. The most irritating thing for me is there's no clipboard, there's no cut and paste or drag between it, which is a real shame. And I'm going to moan about that later. A couple of years ago, I saw Adrian Leeds demonstrating some really nice VNC client software at the Southwest show, and I'm hoping he will finally release that because that looked really nice. In theory, you could run, I'm generally using RISC OS as the server and displaying the screen on the Mac. You could also run it the other way around. So in theory, you could view your RISC OS screen, you could view your Mac screen on a RISC OS box. Traditionally, I haven't done that because I have a higher screen resolution on my Mac than I do on any of my machines up until the PyTools came along. And I also find software like Avalanche is just a little bit flaky compared to the VNC client on the Mac. So let's have a look at that. Let's do some VNC. Okay, so in best Blue Peter tradition, here's one I prepared earlier. So first of all, here's RISC OS. So this is my this is my fast machine. So I'm running it in 1920 by 1080 desktop. So again, you can see it's quite, I normally run it by 256 by 1400 and then run it in full screen mode. It can be a little bit difficult demoing multiple pages. So again, I've got the screen here, and this is screen sharing. So again, let's see how responsive it is. So let's pick that up and drag it. So you can see there is a little lag compared to normal pages. Just making sure I've got the chat window up. No, I'm open. Okay, and sometimes you can get, let's see if I can get it to work. So I'm now going to click this a couple of times. Okay, and what can happen is, yeah. Okay. So if you look carefully, you can see there are some faint grey lines appearing in the display. And what you should also be able to see is if I click here, it can sometimes miss an update. Okay, so I've clicked here. Let's see if I got it. So if I move over there, no. It's going to be like the demo gods. It's going to refuse to do it until. Okay. So I certainly wouldn't be playing games on this. But what you can get is potentially you can get an update where it doesn't update the screen. Okay, that looks like it. So it still looks like it's, so you can see there's some little lines on the left-hand side, and it says the 6th of November. If I force it to refresh, okay, you can see actually it was the 20th of November. So sometimes you can be looking at something which is not correct. So there are some minor glitches, but it's generally running quite well. And what's also really nice here is I actually have all my data files on pCloud, which means that I have multiple boxes set up where I load the calendar onto. So whichever machine I happen to be using, I will get the same data. So long as I'm careful and don't open it on multiple machines, that's not a problem for me. And I also have a nice area for sharing stuff in. So that is RISC OS running on VNC. So this is the VNC client in the Mac, which is screen sharing. Again, some things are disabled. So you can see get and set clipboard. Clipboard is not available because the RISC OS server doesn't support it. And similarly, compressed mode is not, but it's generally fast enough for most things, and it'll pick up typing, and it means I don't have to have multiple screens. So that's VNC. I'll just check my notes, sorry. And let's go, as I said earlier, it can run on anything. So let's also have our, just find it. Okay, looks like I haven't got it easy. Again, it has keyboard shortcuts. So yeah, there it is. So that is VNC. So this is the Pi. So this is the Pi 400 I was lucky enough to win in the raffle. And again, you can see it's reasonably snappy. Pops itself up. Again, I'm running it at 1080 rather than 2256. So 25560, simply to fit it on the screen. So that allows you essentially to have multiple VNC software. There's a VNC client for Linux, so you can see the server is running on the port. There's a password to protect it, and I can export the display to to any machine. In theory, as I say, I could be having the Mac displayed on the Pi if I wanted to. I'm using the Mac as my main machine, so that's why I'm displaying the screens on it. Okay, so let's leave that. Although I've disconnected, that machine's still running, so I could at any point reconnect just by doing that. And password, and I'm back in. So I need to remember to turn those machines off at the plug just because I can't see them. Okay, so that's VNC. So let me go back to my slides. I'm very impressed everyone's still here. I thought I'd look up and see I was the only person in the talk. Okay, so I mentioned that, talked about that. Yep. Okay, so the second way you can use RISC OS on Mac is you can emulate it. When I started using this, I started using Virtual RISC PC, which was the commercial version, which Aaron Timber, I think it was, released. And that was far more polished than RPC EMU, and it ran RISC OS 6. Unfortunately, it stopped working. What happened when Mac update, every time Mac updates something, they will make changes to it. And when Apple introduced Catalina in 2019, they removed support for non-64-bit applications. And Virtual RISC PC was 32-bit application, so it stopped working. So the only option since 2019 has been to run an old version of macOS or to run RPC EMU. If you want to do RISC OS, if you want to emulate RISC OS on the systems. It's a shame, really, because it was very good. So I now use RPC EMU. That's again, there's some interesting question marks on that, potentially. So that has a different maintainer from the Windows Linux version. It's definitely a lot easier to run in the last two iterations. Another reason I used Virtual RISC RPC was it had networking fixed. Up until 09.3, networking was quite fun to set up on the RPC EMU, and it didn't work on the Mac. So it was really nice that that's now appeared. So again, because RPC runs on both of them, you can actually use, I could potentially run it on Linux. So let's fire it up and run it. So let's bring it over. So this is RPC EMU. Again, I have a standard setup. I've got some windows here, which I'll talk about later. So RPC EMU emulates a Mac. Doesn't allow me to run full screen in macOS, but it will resize the screen. So if I change the screen's resolution to make it bigger, it has some interesting settings. When you can set it up, there is an option. You generally compile it on the Linux version. On the Mac version, you can install it. There are two options. One's to use its built-in compiler. The other one is to use the interpreter. I've always used the compiler because in theory it's faster and I never had any problems with it. If we go into preferences, you can see that it has multiple choices. So again, you can choose between running in VB2 mode, I've never tried that, or strong ARM. I tend to stick to strong ARM, 256 megs, and I haven't had any problems with that. If you have particularly fussy software, you can go back to the ARM 600. And you can control the video refresh rate, VRAM. So you can configure how it's set up there. You can also take a screenshot, which is really useful if you happen to be writing articles for a certain online website and need to take screenshots. That's nice there. On the disk, you can configure whether you have floppies set up and CD-ROMs as well. You can have an ISO image, which allows you to mount a virtual image. The settings, again, networking has improved substantially. So it's now essentially out of the box. You can turn down the CPU's usage, and you can also configure the mouse. So you can have different mouse modes. I'm going to talk about mouse later, because obviously the Mac mouse only has 2 buttons, and RISC OS has 3 buttons, which is interesting. So I'm going to talk about how we handle that later. RPC-MU uses the Mac filing system. So here you can see I've created a symbolic link, it's called, to my Mac filing system. So here I can see everything on my Mac filing system. So if I created something on the desktop, I can see it. So I could actually go in, access files on the Mac here. There's some gotchas on there, which I will come to in a little while. One of the annoying things on both of these solutions is I've got no cut and paste. So it's much more complicated to cut and paste data between systems. And we'll talk about ways to do that later in the talk. Important thing to do is to make sure that the filing system can be seen by your backup. So here I've got RPC-MU, it's in my root directory. So that's all being backed up by Time Machine. I can also zip it up, which is quite useful. So if I want to, I can compress it, which will create a zip. It will preserve all of the file settings, which is really useful. So that's where it is, and it's just being backed up. You can see I've made a backup copy of the zip there, and there's the data. So that's actually the raw drive. So if we were to compare that, you can see we've got boot, we've got a PDF file, we've got apps, we've got audio, video, and so forth. So that files is all hosted on the Mac filing system. It doesn't have its own image or filing system. And that has pros and cons, which we'll look at in one of the next slides. Okay. As I said, I could also run RPC-MU in Linux because I've got Linux running on Parallels, but I'm preferring to use the Mac version. I'd rather not go back to the Linux version if I can, because I don't generally use Linux and it's becoming a little bit Russian doll inside a doll inside a doll. So I'm keen to avoid that. Okay, so just check I've covered everything. Yep. Okay, so let's talk about the challenges and issues that we have using RISC OS with Mac. And hopefully some of these will have been pointed to already. So the first one is the Mac is a 2-button mouse system. And there's a trackpad. The trackpad will allow you to emulate 2 buttons. There used to be a plugin that would allow our Magic Mouse on a Mac to emulate any number of buttons. There are essentially a couple of solutions to that. First of all, you can plug a standard 3-button mouse into it, and it will work. I don't tend to do that because I personally don't like to have too many mice lying around on the table. So you can, but if you want to have an extra mouse and you plug a 3-button mouse in, RPC-MU and VNC should generally allow you to use it. The second option you can do essentially is you can use a nice little utility. So I was reading this excellent book by Chris Dewhurst, which has got a nice little utility at the front showing you how to get keyboard clicks and turn them into menus. The menu program I tend to use is WinMenu, which is really nice. And I have it installed on all my machines. And essentially that means that when I press Command, I'll get a menu coming up. So I have the left-hand mouse button on the mouse is doing select. The right-hand mouse button is doing adjust. And the middle button is doing menu. So again, WinMenu, or you can write your own using Chris's code. So that allows you to emulate the 3-button mouse. So that's the solution to the mouse problem. Okay. The second problem that we have is file sharing, so common data formats. So obviously, there are certain files that will work correctly. So for example, we can have Word files, which we can load inside text writer. And we have certain image files. You can do pure text files really easily. So I can save a text file. So let's save, okay. and I can save that. So let's save that to, okay. I'm going to save it to CloudFX for reasons I will explain later. Okay, so I've now saved that into CloudFS. Let's go up to CloudFS here. Let's open the drive. And we now have a file called text file there. I didn't put an ending on it, so it hasn't identified it as a text file. But if I drag that onto Visual Studio, okay, there's my test file. So standard text files will work really fairly easily for separating data between it. If you add a /text or .text, yes, it will be picked up correctly. So text files is one way. Word files with limitations you can share between them. Excel, again, with limitations. If you've got fireworks, you can use some forms of Excel spreadsheet. PDF files work, again, we have PDF file, I spend my life writing PDF libraries, so I can bore you about PDF files all night if you like. But PDF files are designed to be cross-platform, and we have those on we have those on both the Apple systems and RISC OS. So if you want to display files, PDF's great. PNG, JPEG files again. One of the nice things, one of my favorite pieces of software is actually DP scan. So what I can do here is I can do a screenshot. So let's do a screenshot here. And let's not make it too big. So let's do a screenshot of this bit. Okay, so we have a screen. Did I save it? I really need to install the Pinboard 2 on this, and then I'd be able to do that much easier. Let's do it again. Okay, so there's the screen. And again, that's on HostFS. Okay, so we can see that's a standard sprite. Let's drag it onto here. Okay. And what I can now do is I can save it as, and again, these are all the best file formats to use for exchanging files are TIFF, JPEG, or PNG. So let's save it as a PNG file. Let's add a PNG ending. If I put /PNG on it, it will be picked up and I copy it across. So I now have a screen.png file. Let's put that back on my cloud so that you can see it in action. Okay, so the sprite file obviously will not make any sense to the Mac, but if I drag the PNG file across, okay, there's the screen. It's a PNG file, and it's loaded in preview. So this is Apple's standard image tool. So if you want to swap image data, PNG, JPEG, TIFF are great image file formats. SVG partially is a vector format. I haven't really come across a perfect vector format for sharing data across it. And somebody's put in the comments that in fact Graphics Converter can read some older sprite files. So again, there are options, but if you can find a common file format to work in, it makes life much easier. Okay, so something that I've alluded to but haven't really gone into, so let's dive into that, is file mapping. So that's the third issue that we get. So, okay. So by file mappings, what I mean is, let's have a look at my downloads folder. So on my Mac, I've got a downloads folder, and you can see I've got a couple of Word documents. So I've been discussing with a client Word documents. I've got a zip of Cloverleaf file I was playing with, or we'll be debugging testing for them. I can put PDFs in there. If I have a look into downloads directly on the Mac, so if I go through my keyboard shortcut, so I have two ways of looking at the downloads directory. The link that I have created here, this is what's called a symbolic link. So the way you would create that in the Mac is you would go into Windows. So this is Terminal, which is the Mac program allowing me to type in bash. So let's go into let's go into RPC. Okay, so let's go into data. Okay, and let's go into HostFS. Okay, So what I can now do essentially is I can type ln-s, which will allow me to create a link. I always get this the wrong way around, so let's see if I can get it right this time. Okay. Has that worked? Yes, I got it right. So it's target directory on the Mac and keyboard shortcut for it. So if I close this and reopen it, you will see there's now what RISC OS thinks is a directory, which is actually a symlink, and that goes here, and you can see where it says mint that it's got, that's the symbolic shortcut. So if I create a file on the desktop, let's do that. Actually, let's just put one on there. Okay, so that's a Word file. If I have a look in that directory, you will see that, okay, it thinks that that's a text file. I could manually set that to be correct. I'd have to go here and type, is it doc? So what else is it? No, probably Word. Okay, so I could manually set the file, but I'd have to do that for every file. So for example, if I go into the Mac, I'll show you again. So I'm on the Mac here. Sorry, lost my Windows. There it is. And I have a directory called pictures. Okay. And I have a collection of pictures there. So these pictures by default are all being shown as text objects. I could manually set them. So I've got one here. Let's see what this one is. I could manually set this to JPEG. Okay. And as you can see, that's now picked up and that works. But the default option here is for it to regard these as text files. And I don't want to have to manually go and set every file on my Mac system just to be able to make it work. So that's a bit of a pain. And there are ways around it, which I'm going to show you. I was speaking to Stefan from Cloverleaf, and he says his latest version of his viewer should also essentially pick that up. So in theory, if I view this on his machine, it should automatically set them to JPEGs because it has /JPEG at the end of it. So let's have a look at options there. So again, if you look here, you'll see that I've got one version of downloads directory where they're all correctly typed. And then I've got the raw version, which I'm picking up because I'm directly accessing it. And I'll leave that a little later because that would be a spoiler onto a previous slide. So let's clear some space. Okay. So we've discussed ways to map files on. Let's just check I've covered everything. Okay. So file mappings is a problem. I need to be careful. Another issue of file mappings essentially is that, again, you can see there 4 PDF file. There's one view of it and there's the other view of it. So the other issue with file sharing as well is RPC-MU has no ShareFS, and Samba, generally Mac Samba doesn't work until we get an upgrade on the LAN/MAN protocols. It's not going to work. So we need some ways to share files. So let's have a look at that. Just before I do that, something that's important is when you download files, so I've got a download here. You don't really want to decompress zips on the Mac side because it won't have the file mapping set correctly. What you want to do is copy that across as a zip and decompress it, and that will work correctly. As I mentioned earlier, if you back up RPC-MU's data, that's correctly saves it. Because it's in the data directory, it will be correctly saved. You can see the opposite problem here in that because these files aren't really understood by Mac, you'll get little endings like comma A91 because it doesn't understand that because that file format's been set. What we have to do is we have to put /zip as the end of our file format if we want to save across to Mac and have it recognize them. Okay, so let's look at some ways to solve those problems. So we've covered those. Okay. And yeah, so CloudFS. This is one of my favorite pieces of software. I'm going to explain what problems it solves and why I like it. So again, in some respects, I'd say it's a killer application for LSAR from me. I'll show you exactly what it does and why I use it. It allows me to share files between both RISC OS machines, and it works with everything, including RPC-MU. Rob has been very, very kind on his allocation of client licenses to me, because I keep setting up new instances of CloudFS on all the machines and all the virtual machines I have. So thank you to Rob for doing that. It's also an easy way to back up data. And as I said, it's become significantly faster in later releases. So let's have a look and see how that makes my life work easy. So CloudFS is a cloud filing system. Again, you can see here, there's a central drive. So it's stored, it's like Dropbox or any of the other shared systems, except it works with RISC OS. And you can see I've got the cloud version and I've got the RISC OS version. And what's really nice is any files that get saved from RISC OS into this, and any files get saved on the Mac, get their essentially preserve their settings. So you saw when I saved the screen.png, it came across as a PNG. So CloudFS is really nice for providing a central repository for storing files. It's not the fastest filing system, so I wouldn't recommend using it for that. If you want something faster, then one of the new compute-based machines is very, very fast, but it doesn't give the central access. The other nice thing on this is it works anywhere. So if I have to visit clients twice a year, I go to America, I have to go to Switzerland, my files are there. All my machines have the same setup, so they all load this. I load the same organizer data on all machines. And it backs it up as well. So CloudFS is a really nice piece of software to have in conjunction with pCloud. It does a whole lot of things as well. I can back it up. What I can also do is I can share drives on the Mac. So if you look here, you can see I've got, which one have I shared? I've shared, so I have my own daily directory, which has the files that I run my life on. So I have a spreadsheet and organizer file. And then I've also got essentially desktop and downloads. So these are mirrored copies of the desktop. It doesn't always update instantly. So you can see this desktop is empty.
Any idea what time tomorrow, Helen?
Whereas this desktop is not. So it's not perfect, but it's pretty slick and it's pretty good. And it also allows me to back up these files as well. So I can essentially have one central repository. If I show you my boot file for RISC OS, you'll see I actually have the same setup on each machine. So when I run it, I load the same software. So when I run a machine, I'm running Omni. I have a little script called setup cloud, which will log into my pCloud. I'm not going to show it to you because that's my password, and it will also load my organizer, and it'll load a couple of spreadsheets I use. And again, I have DPI scan, private eye, photo filer, paint, win menu, as I mentioned earlier, all set up on there, and Zap. So those are my favorite tools. So that allows me to essentially have multiple machines. So when I'm at home, I've got it running off one of my RISC boxes. When I'm on the move, I've got RPC-MU running it. Over here, I'll just introduce you to this. This is what a PDF file looks like, and it's quite nice because it allows me to show you. So this is the user manual for one of the Cloverleaf things that I'm testing.
Yeah, poor Mary.
And okay, if you open it in Zap, this is what you'll see. Mary. So the PDF files are blob format, but Zap has this really nice feature, and I've actually written an article on this, which hasn't come out in the ROCC magazine yet, but should, has a PostScript mode. So instead of just being random text, which if I open it in, let's open it in Edit.
There's quite a bit to do tomorrow, so
okay. So if I drag that and open it in Edit
tomorrow, so I will have to get up off my backside and help.
Okay. So that's what it would normally look like. And what you can see is instead of a sort of horrible file, I've got nicely colored. May not mean anything to you, but it does to me. So these are objects, dictionaries, all sorts of fun, and it's much easier to use. So when I was writing the PDF software, that was one of my main tools for understanding how the dictionaries are working in a PDF file. So CloudFS essentially is allowing me to operate on multiple systems. It allows me to move the data across. Importantly, it works with everything. So I haven't got shared disks here, but I have got CloudFS running on it. So it allows me to integrate my Mac. It allows me to integrate multiple RISC OS machines, and it allows me to run RPCU and RISC OS on our native our hardware without any problems. Okay, so a couple more slides to talk about. So that's CloudFS. And again, if you haven't tried it, I would strongly recommend giving it a go. It does all of these benefits to you. So how I set up my RISC OS machines, I have mentioned that to some extent. So I have a common set of shared applications. I have a common boot setup. I have shared data on CloudFS. I don't find it quite fast enough. I wouldn't put all my applications on CloudFS, but for data, it's fantastic. And yeah, I'm going to have a moan about naming conventions. Something that does annoy me in RISC OS is sometimes on some of these we have graphics and we have network, and some of them we have internet and we have images. So there's a moan from me that some of these directories are non-standard names. So it'd be really nice to see them standard. And yeah, let's see what's on there. So this is on the RISC OS. So this is on the fast box. So again, this has got much faster hard drives, but again, it's the same setup. I can see the same files. I'm loading the same script. Everything's set up nicely. And it's running, they've been running RIS from RAM. Oh yes, one.
So front room.
Yeah.
Also main.
So my wish list of things I'd like to see. So I decided to shoot for the moon here. So this is what I'd like to see, which would make my life perfect. So first of all, cut and paste between Mac and RISC OS. It would be really nice if I could pick data up from one window and copy it across, rather than having to save the files between it. That's annoying. You can do a potential hack. So I use a piece of software called Basecamp. So you can run Basecamp in RISC OS. So let me just get my window gone. So another way that you can get the data across is you can run, okay. So again, let's jump into ARM. Oh, I haven't copied it across. Okay, I'll just let that boot up while I set it up. So what I can also do is I can run. So if you haven't come across it, this is a program written by 37 Signals, who also invented Ruby on Rails. So this is where I run most of my life. So again, I have a section here. So I have a RISC OS section, I have a company section, I have a planning section for RISC OS articles. So that's a sneak preview of what's coming on. If you looked at it, you can create a page in here. So I can create a new document and I can copy the data across. And one of the nice things about RIS is that you can finally run sophisticated applications like Basecamp on it. So that is another way to copy it across, is essentially using app like browser-based application, because we can run it on both of them. So if I just let that fire up, it will take a minute or two and I'll show you it running. What it will do is it will tell me that it can't quite emulate it, but it will allow me to choose there we are. So continue to Basecamp for a limited time. So this is a classic where the code is looking for Chrome, basically. So you can see essentially I've got the same web tool running on it. So that's another way to copy data. In theory, you can run Office on it, so you should be able to run something like Word as well and cut and paste data between that. I haven't yet tried that. So cut and paste, or the ability to drag and drop files more seamlessly, will be definitely nice. Something that you can't do is easily run multiple options of RISC OS and switch between them. I think there is an experimental test feature in one of the RPC MUs, but it hasn't made it into the releases yet, where you can select different versions. So in theory, when you have RPC MU set up, it would be nice if you could essentially have RPC MU, and then I could have my 371 version of RPC MU, I could have my 530 version of RPC MU, and so forth. I could have my RISC OS Direct version, my Cloverleaf release, and I could just switch between them. At the moment, it's hard coded, so you can't just switch between versions of RPC MU. which is a shame, really. That would be really cool. ShareFS support in RPCMU would be nice. Better RISC OS Samba support, again, would give me another option for sharing data between Macs and RISC OS. And yeah, let's shoot for the moon here. I'd like a Mac port of RISC OS as well, ideally running in a multitasking window with access to the operating system. That shouldn't be too difficult. Okay, so that concludes the formal part of the talk. I hope you found that interesting. I'll just check how many people are still here. Failed to lose too many people. So let's throw the floor open for any questions, thoughts, observations, moans, suggestions on how I can do things better, questions about medieval history. Over to you guys.
Yep. Can you unshare your screen now?
Yep.
Oh.
You were saying that you use CloudFS quite a bit. It does seem like a bit of a universal catch-all, doesn't it?
It's a lot. Certainly 3.1.4 is a lot. I noticed Rob's hiding in the background, so I'll try not to spoil his blushes. But it's certainly, the 3.4 version is a lot faster. It's also really nice because, as I said, it allows me to essentially have a universal setup across multiple machines. So I don't have to. So if I go to the Leicester office, I can just fire up RPCMU, and I've got my organizer set up there. The only thing you have to watch with something like that is obviously you don't want to have multiple copies of the file open at the same time. But that is essentially, that doesn't happen because generally I'll only have one RISC OS instance open. So long as you're not making efforts to corrupt it. I did have a moan to Martin about Organizer, because if you it used to be that if you double click on it, it would open a second copy of Organizer, and I did find that irritating. So I think just to shut me up, Martin's changed it. So the latest version of Organizer, once you've got it loaded, if you try and load a second copy, it will detect that and it will display the current copy. So Martin has graciously fixed that issue. I think that was the biggest issue I had with Organizer, but it is nice for copying data between systems. I wouldn't copy sort of megs and megs of data across onto CloudFS, but for sharing files and also for having a backup, it does work really well, particularly if you have the script as I've set up. You can essentially get it to automatically load stuff. So you can hide the fact that it's sometimes a little slow to start by essentially having it in boot mode. So by the time it's set up, generally I'm making a cup of coffee anyway. So but definitely, I'm a big fan of CloudFS.
Yeah, you were saying that you use RPCMU. I've seen this. Is it a download from the RULE website?
There are multiple places you can get it. There is a download from the RULE website. There is also a copy. So the Mac version is slightly different. It's not supported by the same people. It's done by, I've got the link from GitHub. So there is a GitHub link, and because the Mac works slightly differently, you download what's called a DMG image, and that installs everything for you automatically. So I'll just get the link and I will put it in the chat. Got it. Again, it's as I said earlier, there's an R in it. I could actually run the Linux version as well. I could run Windows on Parallels as well if I was feeling particularly needing to punish myself, and I could run the Windows version.
So, sorry, a quick interrupt. You said before the Mac version of RPCMU doesn't allow you to run multiple versions of RISC OS. There is a trick that works when you start up RPCMU. Don't just double click. Hold down the Shift key when double clicking, and that will ask you to select a data directory. Now, you don't actually have to have just one data directory. You can have as many as you like.
Okay. I will give that a try. That sounds really useful. But it would be nice to be able to essentially configure options in the RPC menu and switch between them. That's what I would really like to see.
Yeah.
I hadn't known that, so I'm really pleased to hear that. Because again, one of the attractions of having something like RPCMU where you're emulating the machine is you can just switch between machines, and indeed you can fire up machines, you can try things. It also makes it really easy to test multiple versions because you can have, a directory of every single RISC OS since 3.7.1 if you want to test it and just switch between them.
Yeah, you were saying that you're using, was it Zap? I can never remember which one's which. I don't use either of them. And the diary thing. It's intriguing that those seem to be, amongst programmers, the most widely used things going. So organize your day and then really get into the insides of programs.
Well, Zap is a particularly useful one because you have the modes. So if you're looking at different types of files, it has some really nice color highlighting, and it is very fast. So unless you're using huge files, it's a lot lighter than something like Visual Source Code. When I'm doing coding, I'm using something like IntelliJ or NetBeans, which are, because they're written in Java, they're generally much heavier. So you wouldn't want to use something of that just to jump into a file quickly. Yeah, I'm trying to avoid starting the argument about edit versus strong ed versus Zap on this call. You can get some other speaker to do that one.
I think it's whichever one works for you, isn't it? But I can see that the color coding is going to help. Not being a programmer myself, I've just got an awareness of it. But I just find it interesting that, rather than using anything in the Mac world, you use something that's, well, effectively towards ancient in the RISC world, isn't it? Yep. Although it's been updated on.
Answer to Richard's question in the thing of how I get cloud effects about Omni Client. I presume that's because I just log in automatically. So I have a little script to log into it. To be honest, I've never noticed anything else. I've just assumed that's what it did. Maybe Rob can enlighten us on that. But I've always found when I've logged in, I get that nice little cloud icon.
Can we just go back to RPCMU a minute?
Yep.
That version that you've just linked, are you saying that version supports networking?
The version I'm using has networking on it, so I'm using networking.
It's just
the older version
I've been using, and it doesn't seem to support networking, or I've never got it working. However, while you were talking and giving your presentation, I did a quick search, and I noticed that there appears to be probably more recent version of RPCMU hosted. Well, it's on the GitHub page, but associated with Cloverleaf, and it appears as though that might have networking support actually supplied. I've only just discovered it, so obviously I haven't been able to check it out at all yet. But
9.4 is the latest, so that's the one that's always worked for me. I haven't had a chance to play with the Cloverleaf one. Again, I think there's personality differences between the teams. So like that's essentially the Cloverleaf is a fork of the original RPCMU.
Yes.
And also most of the changes Cloverleaf put in were for the Windows. So I know they did some work to get certain things like scroll mouse working, but I could never get it to work on the Mac. So maybe it's apathy on my part, but I've just stuck to the generic version of
I didn't even know Cloverleaf had done a version of it until just this minute.
They have got their own version, but I don't think it was done on the Mac, so I haven't had a chance to test it.
Right.
But it's definitely worth a try if you want to experiment with it.
I do want to get networking working because my setup, which is not that dissimilar from yours in that I use RISC OS to some extent still, and primarily a Mac. I actually have a network, a NAS unit, which synchronizes folders or various selections of files between all the Macs. And I used to use my Ionics with that quite happily. Sadly, the Ionics has now died, and my replacement Pinebook is showing strange. Well, how do we describe it? It shows invisible folders and copies invisible folders and does all sorts of odd things that I don't want it to do. So,
what I can do is I'll send you the settings that work for me on the that I have set up on the RPCMU.
Right.
So I've got so I have networking translation NAT. So I have the middle option set on, and that's essentially the should work just out of the box.
Right.
I'll just put that into I'll just upload it if I can. But definitely we can communicate offline. If I can be of assistance to you, just let me know and I'll see.
Thanks.
It is a little bit networking still the last of the dark arts out there.
Yeah, I used to have it working very nicely back in the 90s when things like Apple FS or whatever it was called were around, but things have moved on and don't work no more.
Yeah. Your other option, as I said, is if you're running Parallels on it, you can run the Linux version of RPCMU.
Yes, I could do that. Yes, I just really wanted fairly easy native file sharing on both sides without having to run a virtual machine other than RPCMU.
Yeah. It's a shame that Virtual RISC PC was never updated, because that had essentially much better. That was more polished in a lot of ways.
Yes, it
that
was.
Run RISC OS 6, but they never updated.
I actually
it.
like RPCMU better in some ways. For it's sort of clear. It's a bit of a RISC OS 5 versus RISC OS 6.
Peter told me we don't do politics here, so I'll have to.
Well, let's not do politics. But I prefer RISC OS 5 for lots of reasons.
But RPCMU should give you a reasonable experience on the Mac. As I said, generally, if I have the choice, I'm using native hardware for ARM over VNC. But for traveling, not having, I could buy myself a Pinebook Pro and take 2 laptops, but it's, when I'm traveling, I want to carry as little as possible, and I have a fast Mac here which can do a reasonable job of emulating RISC OS. It's also quite nice where you share the file systems. So there are benefits to, and the Time Machine as well means you don't have to back it up.
Indeed.
As I said, I screwed up the installation of TCP/IP networking, and then I just rolled back my RPCMU version.
Thanks.
Did anyone have any other questions, thoughts, observations, complaints that I've wasted your evening? Desire to move to Southern Yorkshire?
I don't know whether you spotted whizzing past in the comments earlier about there is an option to turn on compression in the VNC server. It's VNC serve Z level, and then someone else has pointed out that there's also a front end called VNC serve FE, which should allow you to twiddle that.
I've tried that. I did try switching it on when I installed it and asked Jeffrey how to set it, and he could never get the VNC client to work with it.
Oh, okay.
So I will go back and test it and see if that works, because you can switch it on inside the VNC server. But what I then found was that, so you have levels of 0 to 9 on compression within VNC server config file. But if you use anything other than 0, instead of a nice RISC OS screen, you get this sort of rather interesting sort of color splash effect. So I will go back and test it. But when I tried to test it, the Mac VNC client, again, all software has its quirks, and one of them seemed to be that VNC serve on the standard Mac VNC's client software didn't support it. But I will give it a try and see if that works.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yep.
Mark, which version of the RPCMU are you using? 0.94 or your 4, the new one? Yeah.
4 is the latest version.
Yeah.
And again, it's been in beta so long, I don't think it'll ever come out of beta. I think it would probably it's just not going to happen. I think they'll keep inventing new levels, but it'll never reach 1.0. I haven't had occasional crashes with it, but generally it's pretty stable.
Okay.
But I've had some issues with the Windows version of RPCMU 0.9.4.
Yep.
With the RISC OS Direct bundle, it won't respond to double clicks very often, and when you type a character, it just runs away with the far too rapid to repeat. But with a RISC OS 3.71 version, it's fine. Same version of RPCMU. I also noticed there's now an RPCMU 0.9.4a on Windows. I wonder if there's been a fix for something.
Yeah. Well, my advice is clear: switch to a Mac, because I never have any of those problems.
I do actually have a Mac, but I just don't have enough disk space free on it to run You had to install virtual to install RPCMU on it.
Yeah, no, 094A. I've only seen that for the Mac. I've not seen a Windows 094A.
It was on the website the last time I checked.
Okay.
It would fix the problem.
You might also, you're running the...
I think the latest Linux one is probably just 0.9.4, which is what I usually use the most.
Yeah. Are you running the compiler version or the interpreted version?
Makes no
Sorry?
difference. I've tried both.
Okay.
It's gone kind of quiet.
I thought I should shut up and let other people do some talking. So
I was trying to remember something to ask. I've forgotten it. Gone out of my mind again now.
It's your age, dear.
I mean, what I hope is I've encouraged people who have Macs to look at certainly RPCMU and VNC. And the nice thing on VNC also is you can run multiple systems. So if you have a couple of Pis, you can have Linux, RISC OS and Mac running on the same system, which keeps your desktop space down substantially, which is very nice.
I can say I'm using a Mac, but I am using Linux Mint on it.
Yeah, so that's the one I've got running. I think if Mint is my personal favorite distribution on Parallels.
No, it's not in Parallels. I just ditched macOS and put Linux Mint.
All right.
On.
Fair enough.
In fairness, it is a 12-year-old Mac, so I don't like things going off to the recycling place too early.
Yes. But there is a speed difference. As I was saying earlier, if RISC OS still runs, we're lucky it still runs nicely on old machines, but if you do put it on, some of these fast new machines from RISC OS bits or RComp or use the titanium, it's just so much more fun to drive.
Do you have any problems with fonts on the PCEMU with
none at all
with Mac? No problems at all.
No, none at all.
In terms of you mentioned about the file types issue.
Yep.
You have you not updated the mappings file, MIME mappings file inside thing so it can pick up the file types?
I don't think it's an issue with it. I've got the mappings file. It's to do with the fact that they're not set. It's the way it's accessing it directly. That's why I'm using CloudFS. Is it doesn't have it. It defaults to a text file if you're using Symlink to access it.
Right.
And also, if you decompress the zip, I mean, Mac has the same issue when you look at RISC OS files. It puts comma, A91 or something on the end of it. So it's not, it's more about two very different systems sort of making different assumptions. So it's not just a one-way process. But the nice thing about CloudFS is it essentially makes sure the file's set correctly whichever way you go. It's slightly slower than doing it directly, but it gets it right.
I was thinking more where, say, a JPEG, as long as you had the JPG extension now /JPG, yep. Along in the MIME type, it should just work regardless of where it is because it should be standard.
Yep.
Obviously, not on one part of the system, then it's not going to work. Obviously, or you don't
yep.
have the extension is not going to work.
Yep.
And I noticed you were using DP
scan.
Yeah. So, yep. I didn't want to use the old name. I'm not supposed to use that now. Using the current version, because that allows you to automatically put the extension on when when you end F3 and the saving. There's an option to automatically have the 3-character extension put on for each type. So where you type /PNG, you can actually get it to do it automatically. I remember right, it's in the configuration somewhere. It's a long time since I've done it.
I will switch it on. As I say, I just, you read the instruction manual when something doesn't work. So I will have a look at it and see if I can do it. That would be useful to do. But it's still, it's a pretty quick way to convert files. Yeah. And it does a really nice job of converting it to those common file formats.
Yeah.
Something that's also quite nice, because I've got the RISC OS bits machine. It's running RISC OS 5.29. So if you have access to 5.29, you've got the ability to do to save images directly from Paint as PNG JPEG. But that's not unless you're running the a sort of cutting edge version until 5.30 is released. It's not quite as easy as just having DPI scan.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you know how many users actually use Macs and RISC OS together, because I was thinking you were asking about MonFS being updated to do something. If that's under the rule setup, then presumably bounties could be had for that.
I don't have any idea how many people are using it. I think if rule or RISC OS developments decided to do a survey, I think it would be an interesting question. I think ironically you've probably got the most likely estimate of that because you get all of the ROCC users to fill out a form, say what machines they use.
We'll have to ask Chris then. see if he got the database online. Did you catch that one, Chris?
No, I can't answer at the moment. I'd have to think. We do have some idea what members have got, but general numbers.
Yeah, I think what's nice on RPCMU as well is being able to tightly couple RISC OS and Mac gives you a much more. You get the synergies and you get the benefits of both systems.
Yeah.
So, like, I generally have. I have RISC OS running in a window, and I will use Zap as my preferred text editor. But I've still got all my music running on iTunes on the Mac.
Yeah.
So essentially, you have a sort of turbocharged machine where you can have, the benefits of whatever operating system you want to use for whatever task available to you, and the ability to share the data between them.
Yeah. In fact, this laptop I'm using at the moment, it's a Windows laptop, but in the background, I've actually got a VNC connection to my 40E2 running RISC OS in the background, and it's easy to have music going on the PC side while you're working on the thing, and or vice versa without any problems.
Cut and paste, or the ability to drag a file onto the VNC window would be, if we were doing a wish list, that would be really nice to have, because that would make it much easier to work between the systems. You're not sort of hacking it by cutting and pasting data into Basecamp or saving files between systems.
Yeah, I wonder if Uniprint would, or Uniserve, as it's better known as nowadays, might help. You can set it so it can transfer files from one system to the other and backwards, and it can also use a clipboard. Although there can be some problems with the clipboard because the recent update to RISC OS to have a global clipboard, there's been some interaction between the two pieces of software. So I use it frequently to launch, say, browsers images onto the Windows machine, and
I think part of the challenge. I think part of the challenge as well is essentially there isn't a standard necessary, unless you go through the VNC protocol, which has a standard. There isn't necessarily, the clipboard on Mac, the clipboard on Windows, and the clipboard on RISC OS are all completely different. So having a generic way to interact them is, that's why I was quite keen to see Adrian Lee's software, because that looked pretty impressive.
Any updates on? Yeah, I was going to say it's the Sendiri is his website, isn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
He showed it at, what was it, Southwest 2020. The biggest
right.
RISC OS show of 2020, obviously.
Yeah. The only one.
Yes. 2020 was funny because I went to a Java conference in Montreal, and they billed it as the biggest Java conference of 2020 because, of course, it was in January 2020. So it was also the only Java conference of 2020. But they got a lot of mileage out of saying they were the biggest conference. And similarly, the Southwest show was the RISC OS event of the in-person RISC OS event of 2020.
Yeah.
But what he had was really nice. So it's frustrating as a user that we can't see it out and running yet.
I think it's all like a double-edged sword of the RISC OS scene, isn't it? That we know everybody does everything, but conversely, if they get busy with something else, whatever you thought they might be doing, they might not be doing it.
Yeah.
It'd be nice if it was sort of like a lottery fund and we just say, can you all do RISC OS full time?
Yeah. I mean, also a lot of us, we're doing it as a passion project rather than, we don't earn any money. It costs us money. So like Icon Bar, I would like to write more than 2 articles a week, but I just don't have the time.
No, that's understandable. Yeah. I
mean, I think a lot of us.
Yeah, when I see what some of you get up to, I go, I'm really doing nothing in my retirement, and you're still working and doing all this stuff. It's greatly appreciated. I'm sure everybody else will pitch in with that one.
So is anyone going to go and rush out and buy a new ARM machine? Or if you want a second-hand MacBook Pro, I could probably get you one.
There you go. It's a very long time since I had anything to do with Macs. My wife used to use one at work years ago, and we bought the same model for her to use at home. I seem to remember the files. They appeared on the GUI as one file, but they weren't. There were two. I think one was called the resource fork and the other was called the data fork. Do they still do that, or is that all history?
Absolutely not. That's about 3 decades out of date.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. I think it was called, the model was an LC2. Does that ring a bell with anybody?
Yes, sounds early 90s.
Yes.
That's before I started using Macs. That you're in the same category as the people who complain that Java is insecure because Java 6 has no security settings. We're now on Java 21, or that your 386 machine just doesn't seem to run Windows very well, or that you've been using RISC OS 3.1 and it really hasn't moved on.
Definitely not complaining, but I always found that a bit odd. And I found RISC macOS okay, but in those days it was only one button mouse, and if there was an error, a little bomb popped up, which would probably be considered politically incorrect now because it might upset people. And in order to eject the floppy disk, you had to drag the floppy disk icon down to the trash icon, which always struck me as weird.
Yeah, the only place you'll find those machines now is probably the computing center, one of the history of computing centers. That's not, that's not a standard Mac. That sort of is more sort of era of my A3000, A5000.
Yeah. I quite liked her Mac because it was bulletproof. It just worked and never fell over.
To be fair, you can still eject disk images by dragging them to the trash if you want to.
No, I'm not that bored. I'll stop recording now, I think, but don't let that